They had to have an upper class. This was not communism writ large. Winston Churchill. This was not a communistic society. This was a regular society with an upper class and a lower class that did not allow kings. And so there was an aristocratic, heroic class that developed. That can't be discounted. He can't go into that too much here. That's a theme that I would like to visit, and I think we'll get later in other texts. But continuing, just remember from here on out that this is a culture that frowns on kings in the traditional sense. The sense of just plain being beholden to a ruler because he's the ruler, for the hell of it, because he's the ruler. That does not fly. Does not fly in Greece, in the Greek culture, for centuries before the Golden Age. Before the Golden Age of Greece came, for a couple of centuries, this was the culture. Quote, an economic spirit of conscious rivalry and a search for gain produced one of the greatest examples of economic growth in all of Western civilization. Attendant thereon were the rise of market economies unknown in the Near East. When he says the Near East, it's actually what we mean, the Middle East is the same thing. So what he's saying is there was an economic spirit in ancient Greece, a rivalry. How do you become the better man? How do you gain more social notoriety? You cannot do it the way they do in other cultures by becoming a king. So there was, quote, the rise of market economies unknown in the Near East. Continuing, the use of coinage. You may know the city-state that first coined coins, Lydia, right? The use of coinage, major technological improvements. In the field of arts and letters there appeared colonnaded stone temples, large-scale sculpture, freehand styles of pottery decoration, and new lyric and choral forms of poetry. I pause for just a moment. The Parthenon, you know, the pillars, and then there's a colonnade up above that. Those were copies in marble of copies in plaster of wooden temples. We can admire the culture of Greece, but if you've read The Fountainhead, you know you can't necessarily just admire the Parthenon as the greatest building of all time or anything. Maybe the greatest building of the Greeks, but even then it was a bit stagnant. Although the age of revolution may be said to cover the century from 750 to 650, so look at the Dark Age ends 800, the Age of Revolution begins 750, ends 650, so that you got a chronological look at it. The Golden Age is around the age 400, 350. I may not be exactly right on that. We'll get to that later. I'm 20 pages ahead in the notes and I haven't hit that yet, but anyways. It is apparent that even though the Age of Revolution was from 750 to 650, it is apparent that in arts and letters the truly great jump occurred virtually in one single generation. So the end of the Dark Ages, and then the foundation of the society that became what you and I know as classical Greece, which had its roots already, but someone took the bricks and laid them down now. Somebody had to lay this foundation down, and it happened in one generation. It's become fuzzy over time. Historians call it a century or so, but as he says, that group of men who were active about the year 700, born in 720, 730 maybe, died in 675 or so maybe, active around the year 700 BC. Sometimes human history evolves at a steady, even pace. Sometimes, though, it virtually leaps. Now, I made a note here a couple years ago when I read this. Surely this group had one or more leaders, one or more individual thinkers, See what a difference an individual can make. We might be able to say, if we get right down to this group and there were a dozen brilliant people who arose in a decade or so. How likely is that? From what we all know of history, ladies and gentlemen. There was probably a forgotten individual who laid down some principles, like Aristotle, or like Newton or Galileo. He did important work no one before him had done, and it laid the foundation for what came afterwards. It laid the foundation for the Golden Age. Now let us talk about the polis. P-O-L-I-S means state. The Acropolis is a hill, the city on a hill. Now, that didn't always happen in ancient Greece. Some people have the idea that they would find a place where they could put their city on the hill and have the farming around that, and that's where they had a city. No, that's where the Acropolis was in Athens, which was the archetypical Greek city-state of all time. That is a good thing to do if you can find an island of rock near an agricultural plain and put your important governmental buildings and temples there. Go ahead and do that. Sure, they did it any time they could. That doesn't necessarily mean that polis is always on top of a hill. But by and large, the archetypical idea, because of Athens, is that it is. Now, the introduction of the city-state came in around 750 to 650, right after the end of the Dark Age. Quote, much later in the 4th century BC, the great political theorists Plato and Aristotle discussed the nature of an ideal political unit. Both of them took it for granted that all truly civilized men would prefer the polis, or city-state. So by the time they were writing, they took it for granted. They couldn't imagine otherwise. It was the definition of civilization was the city-state for Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle indeed went so far as to assert, quote, man is by nature an animal intended to live in a polis. That is from his Politics. Now, I would just make a quick note. Ayn Rand said that his Politics were the most confused and least coherent and principled of his writings. But anyways, continuing. Yet, even at this date, not all Greeks were so organized, and in the Dark Ages there had been no city-states at all, as we understand the term in Greek history. They were born after the Dark Ages. Continuing, the polis evolved out of the tribal kingdom in the late 8th century and continued to consolidate its institutions over the next 300 years. Let me skip just a bit. The city-state, in the simplest terms, was a small but sovereign political unit in which all important activity was conducted at one spot, in which communal bonds expressed in terms of law were more basic than personal ties. So in which case law and order became the rule. In all these respects, the polis grew out of the political organization of the Dark Ages. So there was no political organization in the Dark Ages. As political organization fertilized and became a fact, the Dark Ages ended. I think that's how we have to state that. You know, it's often said that there was this merchant revolution that ended the Dark Ages in Europe. The medieval period as we know it, medieval proper, Dark Ages capitalized. That's ridiculous. There was a coincidental awakening of the worldly sense of the people as they shook off the chains of the dictatorship of the Pope. Coincidental, but they do not understand the cause and effect relationship. So the polis didn't, I don't know, maybe it did grow out of the political organization of the Dark Ages. But the political organization of the Dark Ages is you know, a contradiction in terms. Anyways, let us continue. We skip a bit into the middle of the next paragraph. Athens, which was the largest unified city-state of mainland Greece, covered only 1,000 square miles. The ordinary